In the final years of World War II, as Japan's empire strained under relentless pressure, one question haunted every soldier, naval gunner, and civilian staring upward into the sky. Who are these American pilots? And why do they fight with such terrifying precision? The Pacific skies had become a realm of myth and rumor. Every distant drone of engines sparked countless thoughts: fear, hatred, admiration, and, in some cases, pure awe. For many Japanese, the Americans who soared above them were not simply enemies. They were an entirely different breed of warrior. Stories passed through barracks like whispered legends, tales of pilots who dove through walls of anti-air fire, men who refused to abandon flaming aircraft, aviators who attacked with the calmness of machines but the fury of demons. Japanese soldiers had fought Chinese, British, Dutch, and Australian forces, but the American pilots brought a new kind of war, one that merged industrial power with almost reckless individual courage. And that combination shook Japan in ways no propaganda could hide. Japanese schoolchildren were taught that the enemy was weak and soft, but the sky contradicted that lie every single day. When formations of B-17s and later B-29s appeared over the horizon, their enormous wingspans glinting in the sun, villagers described them like floating mountains made of steel. Even before dropping a single bomb, the psychological effect was devastating. Farmers stopped working, mothers rushed their children indoors, and soldiers stared upward with an uncomfortable truth settled in their hearts. America had brought a kind of power Japan could not match. And accompanying these bombers were the fighter pilots, P-38s slicing through clouds like silver knives, F-6F Hellcats growling through the sky, and, eventually, the P-51 Mustangs whose speed and grace shocked even veteran Japanese aviators. The Japanese respected skill, bravery, and endurance, qualities celebrated in samurai tradition. So when they witnessed American pilots surviving impossible damage, returning day after day, and fighting with relentless aggression, respect grew quietly in the shadows of war, even when publicly denied. Every air battle added new stories: an American fighter chasing a Japanese bomber across mountains until both vanished behind smoke, a pilot who bailed out near a coastal village but tried to save wounded Japanese civilians from a fire before being captured, and bomber crews who refused to leave injured comrades even as their aircraft burned. During early stages of the war, Japanese pilots, highly trained, disciplined, and often superior, dismissed the Americans as inexperienced and clumsy. But by mid-1943, the tone changed dramatically. New American pilots were better trained, better equipped, and flying aircraft that pushed engineering limits. And something else shocked Japan deeply. These pilots fought with a strange mixture of teamwork and individual daring. They weren't bound by rigid doctrine. Instead, they improvised. They adapted. They learned from every loss, and they learned fast. A Japanese officer wrote in his diary after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, "The Americans fight without hesitation. Their courage is frightening. They attack like men who expect to win." Japanese ground troops, too, saw their patterns. They noticed how American fighter pilots protected damaged bombers, how they circled crash sites searching for downed comrades, how they refused to abandon formations. This confused many Japanese soldiers who believed Americans avoided risk. They realized the truth: American pilots were not running from danger, they were drawn toward it. They were fighting for survival, for revenge after Pearl Harbor, for each other, and for a nation that had unleashed the full power of its industry, its science, and its willpower. Japan learned that American pilots did not come to negotiate. They came to end the war. Civilians heard the thunder of B-29 engines long before the aircraft appeared. The sound alone became symbolic of the inevitable of a storm too large to stop. Some described it as the sound of a giant knocking on the doors of the sky. Children covered their ears, elderly villagers prayed, and even hardened soldiers felt their stomachs tighten. Many Japanese officers admitted privately that each new wave of American pilots carried a message: the war was slipping away. Yet in the midst of fear, there was also a kind of grudging respect. Japanese pilots, especially the elite ones, understood difficult battles, but when they fought against American aces, they sensed something familiar: the same fire, the same discipline, the same love of flight. Even in hatred, there was recognition. And then came the biggest shock of all: American pilots showed compassion. There are recorded Japanese testimonies describing U.S. pilots dropping notes warning civilians to evacuate areas that would be bombed. Others mention fighter pilots avoiding lifeboats at sea, refusing to fire on men who could no longer fight. These moments confused Japanese citizens who had been taught that Americans were heartless beasts. "How can a demon show mercy?" one villager wrote. This contradiction cracked holes in wartime propaganda. So by 1945, the Japanese view of American pilots was a layered complexity of fear, awe, frustration, admiration, and disbelief. They were seen as the symbol of a powerful nation, as the bringers of destruction, as warriors worthy of respect, and sometimes even as human beings trapped in the same furnace of war. The American pilots were not just enemies in the sky. They were the face of a coming future that Japan could no longer escape. As the war dragged toward its brutal climax, Japan's understanding of American airmen evolved into something far deeper, almost philosophical. The skies above the Pacific had become a vast stage where two cultures collided, not just with weapons, but ideologies, training, discipline, and worldview. Japanese soldiers, sailors, and civilians watched American pilots with a mixture of dread and fascination. They were enemies, yes, but enemies whose determination reshaped the meaning of air warfare. When Japan's early war aces first encountered U.S. pilots, they found them inexperienced and predictable. Yet within months, the Americans began closing the gap with astonishing speed. New tactics like the thatch weave neutralized Japanese maneuverability. This adaptability stunned Japanese commanders. They were accustomed to long, intensive training cycles. But the Americans were producing pilots through a system that blended mass production with innovation, turning thousands of young men into competent aviators at a pace Japan could never match. What Japan realized too late was that every American pilot represented not only his own courage, but the entire engine of a modern superpower behind him. The sky had become America's domain, and Japan felt the weight of it every single day. On the ground, Japanese civilians often described American aircraft as creatures of metal whose shadows swallowed entire neighborhoods. Children would watch the formations approach from miles away, pointing and whispering, "America no Torai," the American birds. Even when air raid sirens wailed, some villagers couldn't help staring upward, mesmerized by the size, speed, and sheer confidence of these machines. Pilots of the P-51 Mustang and F-6F Hellcat became infamous among Japanese ground troops. Their sudden dives were so fast that soldiers joked, "They strike before their engines reach the sound of your fear." But what struck Japan more deeply than the machines themselves was the behavior of the men flying them. American pilots were relentless. They pressed the attack even when outnumbered, even when damaged, even when fuel was low. This was not the cautious, defensive style Japan had expected. Instead, they encountered opponents who seemed to carry a deep, unwavering resolve. Many Japanese interpreted this as revenge for Pearl Harbor, and in many cases, they were right. Yet the respect Japan developed for American pilots did not come from fear alone. It came from witnessing a strange combination of discipline and freedom. Japanese pilots trained under strict hierarchy and code. They were expected to obey without hesitation. American pilots, however, were encouraged to make split-second decisions, to improvise, to trust their instincts. This flexibility made them unpredictable, and unpredictability in war is terrifying. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai later wrote, "American pilots may not have the elegance of Japanese flyers, but they have something more powerful: confidence without arrogance." His words echoed through post-war Japan as people tried to understand how a small island empire had been overwhelmed by an enemy whose strength seemed both mechanical and human. Japanese troops stationed on Pacific Islands often gained a front-row seat to the unfolding drama. They watched as American fighters peeled away from bomber formations with mathematical precision, or as damaged aircraft limped across the sky trailing smoke, yet refusing to fall. Some soldiers described the Americans as possessing iron spirits inside iron machines. Even those who never encountered American pilots directly heard the stories of pilots who bailed out only to fight on land, pilots who landed in the ocean but survived for days, pilots who led squadrons with a calmness that unnerved even their enemies. These tales spread among Japanese forces, altering their perception of the man in the cockpit. They began to understand that American pilots were not mere products of machinery. They were warriors shaped by desperation, innovation, and a national will to win. In civilian diaries discovered after the war, the emotions varied drastically. Some wrote about terror, the fear of the sky, the nightmares triggered by the sound of engines. Others wrote admiration, even unwilling admiration. One woman from Osaka wrote, "They come from the sky like gods. Not our gods, but gods of a different world, a world too powerful for us to stop." Another diary entry from a teenage factory worker read, "I hate them, but I respect them. They fight bravely." These raw emotions revealed a truth often hidden under wartime censorship. Japan's people were not blind to American skill. They saw it. They felt it. But among Japan's military thinkers, and especially among surviving pilots, the respect was even more explicit. After battling American airmen over the Pacific, many Japanese flyers admitted privately that American pilots were among the toughest opponents they had ever faced. They fought in teams, protected each other, and valued every life. This was a stark contrast to Japan's own approach, which often prioritized sacrifice over survival. American pilots fought to live. Japanese pilots fought even if it meant dying. This difference shaped the outcome of air battles across the Pacific and deeply influenced Japanese perceptions. By 1945, the skies over Japan were ruled by American aircraft. Every day brought new bombings, new battles, new losses. But it also brought new insights. Japan had come to understand not just the power, but the character of American pilots. They were fearless, relentless, disciplined, compassionate at times, brutal at others, but undeniably formidable. They represented a nation that had turned its industrial strength into wings of fire. And though they brought destruction, they also brought an undeniable truth. The middle of World War II, Japan had stretched itself thin across thousands of islands in the Pacific, from the Philippines to the Solomon Islands, from New Guinea to the Aleutians. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces were facing a problem they had underestimated: the sheer volume, skill, and resilience of American pilots. Japan's own training programs were rigorous, intense, nearly inhumane, producing the legendary Zero Aces who could outmaneuver almost any Allied aircraft early in the war. But Japan's industrial capacity could not match that of the United States. Each time a Japanese squadron was lost, the pilots could not be replaced fast enough, and the machines, once feared, were slowly outclassed. Meanwhile, the United States had established an extraordinary system. Thousands of pilots trained every year, equipped with aircraft that could endure more punishment, climb higher, and deliver greater firepower than almost any Japanese machine. By 1943, Japanese intelligence reports began to note a chilling pattern. Our losses are not only numbers, they are experience, leadership, and morale. The Americans keep coming. The Americans had turned attrition into strategy. They produced more pilots, more planes, and more tactics faster than Japan could adapt. And each new pilot was better than the last. For Japanese commanders, this was more terrifying than firepower alone. It represented a psychological advantage. Every dogfight ended not only with death and destruction, but with the unsettling realization that the Americans would never stop, would never tire, and would keep returning no matter the cost. Diaries from Japanese air officers reveal the mental toll. They were trained to fight, yet every encounter forced them to confront a new, unpredictable enemy who did not follow the rules they understood. The Pacific sky had become a battlefield of not only machines, but wits, courage, and endurance. The geography of the Pacific played a critical role in this escalating challenge. Small islands, hidden airstrips, and jungle-covered terrain became both sanctuaries and death traps. Japanese pilots relied on their deep knowledge of these regions, using low-level flying to evade radar, storm patterns, and superior firepower. But American pilots adapted quickly. They learned island approaches, studied Japanese tactics, and coordinated large-scale attacks that combined bombers and fighters with deadly precision. By 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, later nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, demonstrated the growing dominance of the Americans. Japanese naval aviation lost hundreds of aircraft, many trained aces were killed, and entire carrier fleets were devastated. The psychological impact on Japan was staggering. Reports from Japanese commanders noted something unprecedented: the Americans fight without fear. Even when trapped, they fight with the tenacity of a man who has nothing left to lose. Japanese pilots were bewildered. They had always measured courage, discipline, and skill according to their own code, yet the Americans seemed to operate on a different scale, a combination of industrial support, ingenuity, and personal determination that Japan could neither emulate nor predict. It was here, in the thick heat of the Pacific conflict, that Japanese perceptions began to shift from initial dismissal of the enemy to genuine fear and grudging admiration. They realized that American pilots were not only technically skilled, but strategically superior, psychologically resilient, and extraordinarily adaptable. These were not the inexperienced flyers they had once mocked. They were the new standard of air warfare, and Japan was struggling to keep up. The Americans' approach to air warfare was both methodical and relentless. Where Japan relied on instinct, tradition, and superior maneuverability early in the war, the United States emphasized training, teamwork, and tactical flexibility. Pilots were taught energy fighting, coordinated squadron tactics, and rapid adaptation. Each engagement became a lesson. Every loss was studied and corrected, ensuring that the next pilot would be smarter, faster, and more deadly. Japanese officers could not comprehend the speed of this adaptation. Letters and diaries describe moments when a pilot expected to execute a familiar maneuver to escape or counterattack, only to find an American waiting, anticipating his every move. This constant pressure sapped morale while simultaneously impressing even the hardest veterans with the courage of their enemy. For the Japanese, it became clear that they were no longer fighting a single enemy plane, they were fighting a system. The entire American war machine, a combination of industrial might, human ingenuity, and relentless determination. The human factor added another terrifying dimension. American pilots displayed a willingness to risk life and limb in ways that Japan's strict hierarchy had rarely anticipated. Stories of pilots refusing to abandon aircraft, saving comrades mid-flight, or continuing attacks while wounded spread quickly among Japanese forces. One pilot who survived Guadalcanal later wrote, "As Japan's air power waned, the reverence and fear of American pilots intensified." By 1945, the war had evolved into a contest of endurance. Every Japanese pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every American pilot killed was quickly replaced. The disparity in industrial and human resources became evident in every engagement. Documents recovered after the war show Japanese officers making sobering notes. "Our men are courageous, but they cannot match the endless tide of these American aviators. Their courage is calculated, relentless, and overwhelming." Japan's pilots began measuring the enemy not just in planes, but in persistence, tactics, and psychological resilience. The very men who were meant to be the enemies of Japan, the American pilots, had become symbols of something Japan could not control or defeat. And for the soldiers, sailors, and civilians forced to witness this transformation, the truth was unavoidable. These pilots were not simply opponents. They were the embodiment of the unstoppable force bearing down on the Pacific, the human face of a nation's industrial and military might, and the reason the war in the skies could no longer be predicted, controlled, or won. In essence, Japan was learning the ultimate lesson: victory would not come from skill or tradition alone. It would require adaptation, resources, and courage at a level their empire could no longer sustain. By 1943, the Pacific had become an unforgiving stage of aerial warfare, a battleground where skill, courage, and strategy collided in the skies above remote islands, open ocean, and jungle-covered mountains. The Japanese believed their Zero fighters were unmatched, a symbol of invincibility and discipline. Yet, each engagement with American pilots chipped away at that myth. One of the most dramatic moments occurred during the Solomon Islands campaign, particularly over Guadalcanal, where Japanese and American pilots clashed in extended dogfights that left planes smoldering, pilots terrified, and ground troops staring upward in awe and horror. American pilots displayed an unrelenting aggression that the Japanese had not anticipated. They used altitude advantage to dive at incredible speeds, striking with precision before quickly retreating to avoid counterattacks. They formed tight formations, covering each other with coordinated maneuvers that neutralized the traditional Japanese advantage of agility and tight turning. Diaries from Japanese squadron leaders reveal their shock. "We thought we were the masters of the sky. They have proved us wrong in every encounter. They dive, strike, and vanish before we can react." In many cases, inexperienced American pilots, trained only months prior, executed attacks that Japanese veterans found nearly impossible to counter. They attacked relentlessly, returned to battle after heavy damage, and demonstrated a psychological resilience that broke Japanese morale. Each encounter was a lesson, a testament to the Americans' ability to adapt, to survive, and to innovate under fire. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, later nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, remains one of the most dramatic examples of American air supremacy. Japanese naval aviation, once feared across the Pacific, suffered devastating losses. Hundreds of aircraft were shot down in a single day, including highly trained aces whose experience had taken years to cultivate. For Japanese commanders, the scale of destruction was staggering. Over 600 aircraft lost, pilots gone forever, and morale shattered. Yet, the psychological impact extended beyond numbers. The surviving Japanese pilots, many of whom had expected to dominate the skies, were forced to confront a new reality. American pilots not only possessed skill and courage, but seemed almost impervious to fear itself. Witnesses described American aviators pressing the attack even when outnumbered, diving into flak-filled skies with no hesitation, and using their technological edge, radios, radar, and superior machine guns, to coordinate strikes with deadly precision. One Japanese observer wrote, "They are not afraid of our numbers. They are not afraid of our fire. They are fearless, and in that fearlessness, they terrify us." The battle did not just mark a turning point in aerial combat, it shattered the perception of Japanese invincibility in the air and forced a grudging respect for the men behind the American machines. The drama of these encounters extended beyond strategy and skill. It was intensely personal. Japanese pilots often faced American adversaries they had seen in previous battles, and yet each encounter felt like facing a different kind of threat. The Americans' relentless adaptability made each dogfight unpredictable. Tactics like the thatch weave, originally designed to counter the Zero's agility, proved devastating. When two American fighters crossed paths in perfect coordination, Japanese pilots found themselves trapped, with no escape from crossfire. The human element added another terrifying layer. American aviators fought with a mixture of desperation and determination, often refusing to retreat even when facing overwhelming odds. Pilots were known to press attacks in damaged planes, pull off maneuvers that should have been fatal, and even attempt rescues of fellow aviators in the midst of battle. Letters and diaries recovered after the war reveal Japanese astonishment. They do not fear death, they embrace it to complete their mission. "We have never seen courage like this." On the ground, Japanese civilians and soldiers alike watched the aerial duels unfold as the Pacific became a theater not just of destruction, but of human endurance and ingenuity. They noted the skill, audacity, and psychological resilience of American pilots, often comparing them to mythical warriors descending from the sky. Some of the most shocking examples occurred during late 1944 raids over the Mariana Islands and the Philippines. Japanese airfields were bombed repeatedly, while fighter pilots scrambled to defend their territory against the unrelenting onslaught. In one account, a Japanese air squadron attempted to intercept American bombers, only to find themselves trapped by superior numbers and tactics. Pilots described seeing American fighters peeling off from the main formation with precision and striking in coordinated attacks that decimated the Japanese formation in minutes. The speed, accuracy, and fearlessness of the Americans left Japanese commanders in disbelief. Civilian accounts added to the legend. Children, farmers, and workers wrote about the metal birds that came like storms, striking without warning, yet following codes and formations that indicated intelligence, discipline, and courage beyond ordinary comprehension. Over time, these reports were studied by Japanese military analysts who reluctantly admitted the psychological and strategic superiority of the Americans. The enemy pilot is not just skilled, he is relentless, adaptable, and unafraid. This is a force we cannot ignore, one report stated. By late 1944 and early 1945, American air superiority was cemented not just through victories. Japanese pilots who survived these encounters carried stories of unending courage and tenacity that became both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The Americans did not rely solely on planes or weaponry. They relied on human ingenuity, unshakable resolve, and the will to survive and dominate. The skies of the Pacific had transformed into a proving ground where the myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered, and the reality of American courage and adaptability was established. For Japan, this was the harshest lesson of the war. Their enemies were not machines, they were men, willing to risk everything, adapt faster than expected, and conquer through a combination of. By 1944, the Japanese military was facing a reality they had long refused to admit. Despite years of rigorous training, a culture steeped in honor, and elite fighter pilots once thought invincible, the empire was being outmatched in ways that could no longer be ignored. The twist was not just technological, it was human, psychological, and strategic. American pilots were evolving faster than Japan could anticipate. They were no longer merely attacking, they were analyzing, learning, and implementing new tactics in real time. Japanese intelligence intercepted radio chatter from U.S. formations and noted something shocking. The Americans adapted to Japanese moves almost instinctively, anticipating maneuvers and countering them before Japanese pilots could react. In some cases, they even studied captured aircraft to understand weaknesses, redesigning their attacks accordingly. The Japanese term, kami no teki, enemy of the gods, was whispered in secret reports, a recognition that the Americans had achieved a terrifyingly human form of invincibility. Diaries and letters from Japanese pilots described the confusion, fear, and disbelief. They know before we act. They adapt before we strike. This is not just skill, it is something beyond comprehension, wrote one ace after barely surviving a dogfight over the Marianas. The skies that had once been Japan's realm were now an unpredictable battlefield where every engagement carried a high risk of annihilation, and every victory felt fleeting. But the twist went even further. While Japan struggled to defend islands, airfields, and supply lines, American pilots were conducting combined operations that seemed almost impossibly coordinated. Fighters, bombers, and naval aircraft struck in perfect synchrony, crippling Japanese logistics and morale. In one extraordinary campaign over the Philippines, American forces decimated Japanese air capabilities in a single night, destroying hundreds of aircraft on the ground while simultaneously downing trained pilots in the air. Survivors were forced to retreat to isolated airstrips or improvised fields, often without fuel, ammunition, or communications. This collapse revealed a shocking reality. Japan's elite training, its tactical doctrines, and even its venerated pilots could not withstand the combined weight of American ingenuity, industrial power, and relentless courage. The human toll was staggering. Veteran pilots who had survived years of combat began to doubt the efficacy of their own skill. Younger pilots, still untested in prolonged war, were thrown into the skies without support. Japan's military began to rely increasingly on kamikaze missions, desperate attempts to slow a tide that could not be stopped by conventional means. Even the most disciplined officers admitted privately that the war was no longer about winning battles, it was about survival. American pilots had not just turned the tide, they had rewritten the rules of the Pacific War entirely. The most shocking revelation came not from statistics or reports, but from personal encounters that defied expectation. Japanese pilots who survived air battles were often forced into impossible choices: fight, flee, or die. Yet time and again, they encountered American pilots who displayed a combination of fearlessness, compassion, and ingenuity that left them questioning everything they had been taught. There were instances where downed Japanese aviators were spared by American flyers, sometimes rescued from the ocean or shielded from ground attacks. This behavior conflicted with everything the Japanese military had drilled into its personnel. The enemy is ruthless and mercy is weakness. The psychological impact was profound. Pilots who had been conditioned to hate, fear, and dominate their foes began to recognize the humanity, skill, and audacity of the Americans. In the words of one Japanese survivor, "They fight with a courage I cannot hate, yet I fear them more than any machine or strategy." This unexpected combination of relentless aggression and human unpredictability was a twist Japan had never anticipated. It was no longer enough to train for dogfights or rely on superior maneuverability. The Americans were reshaping the battlefield with tactics, morale, and audacity that Japan could not counter without transforming its entire approach to war, a transformation that, by 1945, it was too late to achieve. The consequences of this twist were felt across the Pacific. Entire Japanese squadrons were rendered ineffective, not merely through losses in the air, but through psychological attrition. Veteran pilots began avoiding engagements, officers hesitated to commit forces, and morale among the youngest recruits plummeted. The Americans' unpredictability shattered Japan's rigid hierarchy and forced pilots to confront a reality in which traditional codes of honor could no longer guarantee survival. Civilian populations, witnessing the destruction from above, began to understand the full scale of the American threat. Cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, and Manila saw waves of bombers escorted by fighters that operated with terrifying precision. Japanese propaganda attempted to spin these attacks as temporary setbacks or lessons for courage, but soldiers and civilians alike knew the truth. The enemy had adapted faster than they could. Even the most disciplined units admitted that a single squadron of Americans could rout entire formations of seasoned Japanese pilots if they coordinated properly. Perhaps the most startling twist was the realization of how dependent Japan had become on ritual, tradition, and doctrine, while American pilots relied on improvisation, technology, and raw human resilience. While Japan emphasized loyalty and honor, the Americans emphasized results, adaptability, and speed. Every encounter reinforced the gap. When the war ended, surviving Japanese pilots reflected on these experiences with a mixture of fear, respect, and disbelief. They recounted stories of the Americans diving from impossible heights, pressing attacks with no concern for odds, and adapting strategies mid-flight in ways Japan had never anticipated. "We were trained to honor our code above all," one pilot wrote. They were trained to survive, adapt, and dominate, and they did it brilliantly. This combination of relentless aggression, innovation, and sheer unpredictability became the defining twist of Japan's air war. The enemy was not just a collection of men, but a force that could think, adapt, and endure faster than Japan could respond. It was a revelation that reshaped the way survivors remembered the conflict, and it underscored a truth that would echo long after the last dogfight. In war, the most dangerous weapon is not machinery or numbers, it is the human mind, combined with unyielding courage and adaptability. As the war entered its final, grueling months, the skies of the Pacific had transformed from battlefields into unforgiving proving grounds, where skill, courage, and human endurance were tested beyond imagination. The American pilots, now hardened veterans of hundreds of missions, dominated the skies with a combination of audacity, innovation, and relentless pressure. Every sortie they flew was calculated, precise, and adaptive, leaving Japanese pilots struggling to keep pace. Their previously feared Zero fighters, once symbols of invincibility, could no longer secure air supremacy. The Americans' ability to coordinate bomber escorts, fighter cover, and reconnaissance missions with unparalleled efficiency shattered Japanese confidence. From the Mariana Islands to the Philippines, Japanese forces found themselves outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and psychologically unprepared for the relentless ingenuity of their opponents. Each day brought new strategies, new formations, and new psychological challenges that Japan could neither predict nor counter. Diaries and reports from Japanese aces capture the gravity of their despair. We fought with every ounce of skill and courage, yet each time we climbed into the sky, we faced a force that seemed to anticipate our every move. They were not just pilots. They were a storm we could not evade. The human element of the American effort added layers of complexity that Japanese pilots could not understand fully. It was not only their superior aircraft or numbers, it was their psychological resilience, their ability to learn instantly from mistakes, and their willingness to press attacks under impossible conditions. Stories abound of pilots diving into anti-aircraft fire to protect bombers, engaging multiple enemy fighters while wounded, or saving comrades mid-flight. Each encounter left Japanese aviators both terrified and awed. One veteran wrote, "I have fought all my life according to the codes of my empire, honoring discipline and courage. But these Americans fought differently. They were fearless, creative, and relentless. I could not predict them, could not control them, and could not defeat them as I had defeated others before." On the islands below, civilians and soldiers alike watched these dogfights with fear and fascination. Smoke trails and contrails carved the sky like scars of war. Crashing planes, spiraling into the ocean, or burning fields were grim spectacles, yet the Americans' fearless coordination impressed even those meant to be their enemies. Entire Japanese squadrons were decimated not only by firepower but by a psychological pressure that made the impossible feel inevitable. The final months of the war revealed the ultimate paradox. Despite Japan's disciplined training, elite pilots, and doctrine of honor, it was human ingenuity, adaptability, and relentless courage that determined survival. Japanese forces began relying on kamikaze missions, a desperate attempt to regain initiative, but even these acts, steeped in ideology and self-sacrifice, could not overcome the Americans' superior coordination, industrial might, and mental resilience. Veteran Japanese officers noted the painful irony. Their pilots were trained to honor duty above all, yet in this new form of total war, honor alone could not secure victory. The skies became arenas of both extraordinary heroism and tragic futility. When Japan officially surrendered in August 1945, the Pacific sky finally fell silent. Yet the consequences of the air war reverberated far beyond the moment of surrender. American pilots returned as heroes, celebrated not only for their skill, but for courage under fire, adaptability, and unrelenting perseverance. Japanese survivors, however, faced a more complicated reckoning. The air war had imposed a psychological toll that numbers could never capture. Each Japanese pilot carried the weight of fallen comrades, ruined airfields, and the awareness that the Americans' ingenuity and adaptability had repeatedly outclassed their own. Letters and memoirs from Japanese aviators reveal haunting reflections. We were taught to value honor above all else, yet we were constantly confronted by men who fought not for pride, but for survival and victory, and in that, they were superior. The skies, once a symbol of Japanese mastery and pride, had become a mirror reflecting the limits of tradition, discipline, and ideology in the face of unyielding innovation. The human stories that emerged were both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Pilots recounted moments of disbelief, observing American flyers dive from impossible heights, executing splits and turns that should have been fatal, coordinating attacks with pinpoint precision. and yet maintaining focus on survival and mission completion. One Japanese ace described a dogfight where an American pilot, despite a damaged engine, continued to protect his comrades and press the attack, demonstrating courage that defied understanding. I had never seen fearlessness like it, and yet it was disciplined, calculated, and terrifying. I could not hate them, I could only fear and respect them. Civilians on occupied islands, who witnessed waves of American fighters and bombers, noted a similar combination of awe and terror. Farmers, students, and laborers described the American aviators as almost superhuman, moving through the skies with precision, daring, and unbreakable resolve. For Japanese forces, these encounters were not just battles, they were existential tests, redefining courage, honor, and the very concept of skill in warfare. Beyond individual heroism, the broader strategic and psychological implications were monumental. Japanese military doctrine, once reliant on rigid hierarchy and strict adherence to tradition, had failed to anticipate the rapid adaptability of the American Air Forces. Every loss, every engagement, reinforced the brutal reality. Industrial might, human resilience, and adaptive thinking had become the defining factors in modern warfare. The war's end did not erase these lessons. Instead, it highlighted them with unprecedented clarity. Japanese survivors grappled with a paradoxical mixture of pride, grief, and admiration. They had fought valiantly, yet had been decisively outmaneuvered. They had endured hardships unimaginable to most civilians, yet their sacrifices were overshadowed by the Americans' relentless innovation and courage. The legacy of these aerial confrontations extended far beyond the battlefield. Military academies worldwide studied these campaigns, analyzing tactics, human behavior, and the psychological dynamics of air combat. Scholars debated endlessly how much of victory was due to industrial capacity, how much to training, and how much to human ingenuity and adaptability. Survivors from both sides of the Pacific Air War became living reminders of these lessons, embodying the costs of courage, the limits of tradition, and the transformative power of innovation under extreme pressure. And while the guns fell silent, the skies remained etched in memory, monuments to heroism, tragedy, and the unshakable will of men who dared to dominate the air in ways history had never seen. Ultimately, the Pacific Air War was a story of paradox, of extraordinary skill confronted by relentless innovation, of courage meeting adaptability, of tradition meeting the unyielding force of modern strategy. It was a testament to the human mind, the human spirit, and the unimaginable costs of war. The men who survived, whether American or Japanese, carried these lessons for life.